Disclaimer. This video is gonna be a lot more harsher and controversial because I am about to lose my temper. I don't think I've been more angry about a certain someone. Viewer discretion is advised. Now that James has finished tearing Donald and Douglas apart, he now steams full speed ahead to the next battle that awaits him against Bilbert Audrey's first ever character, the ever so legendary engine that upholds that legacy, Edward. This has often been the most debated topic over in those Thomas vs. Shorts, but most of them, every of them, all come to the same conclusion. Edward wins, with high to extreme difficulty. They say Edward wins because of his faster speed, skills, massive endurance, form of strength such as pushing, and the idea that Edward could exploit James's ego to turn the tide. To name a few, Train Friend 234, Sold Edits, at Sir Handley, at Henry the Green Engine 3, Fluffy Waffleless, and anyone else I could mention all have Edward beating James. Or does he really? Before I continue, off topic a little bit, but as someone who's, into the Godzilla fandom, I must say, now that I come to think of it, this matchup topics kind of reminds me of that legendary / monsterverse Godzilla vs. Final Wars Godzilla topic. Both of them have combatants that are fairly close in powers and stats, though of course legendary is increasing in power due to being more active, and it has been one of the most debated topic behind the likes of, Heisei versus Monsterverse Godzilla matchup. For the simple fun of it, I'ma just view James as the legendary Monsterverse Godzilla and Edward as Final Wars Godzilla. But all that yada out of the way, let's get into it by starting over as always, with the best feats and advantages over the Railway Series model to CGI appearance, and what their disadvantages could be, and how it may affect how the battle will perform. So since James has already been done before, it shouldn't be too difficult to understand. James has the power of the bronze. He has great strength and power, is overall bigger and heavier, and is more than capable of handling the Express if Gordon is out. His biggest weaknesses, of course, comes from his egotistic ego and narcissistic behavior, which could lead to an exploit. But onto Edward, well, if anyone are to be fully aware of Edward, his biggest strength and advantages of all against James is his greater intelligence, experience, skills, and knowledge. His overall mentality, but not just his mentality, but some of the best physical performance, with it being his endurance. Despite his old age, he is more than capable of taking in as much pain and damages as he needs to, tolerating them, with one of his best showings being in his exploit stories where one of his driving wheel was out of order due to a snap cranked bin, and yet, despite his situation, was able to press on with one wheel in the harshest storm and pulling his passenger train that is packed with tourists. There are many more feats I could get up, but Edward should be solidly established enough for this matchup. For his weaknesses, of course, as mentioned, comes from his slightly smaller size and his performance. It doesn't at all help that his Spaces K2 class is, realistically a lot more weaker, even more weaker than the likes of Duck and maybe even Thomas. Even if the Discord buddies, ends up trying to debunk, saying that Edward is modified and has, maybe a bit more attractive effort pounds and all. Well, let's see how that works. So, with what is established, how would the matchup play out? Unfortunately, this is where the controversial part comes up. I don't have much good news for Edward. This is probably going to be by far one of the most controversial matchup ever, and the most controversial result of all. Maybe even after Thomas vs. Duck. But to simply say it, Edward can't, doesn't, and simply just won't beat James. But Edward is faster! Well, I hate to say it, but, well, there is not exactly a confirmed source for both James and Edward's speed. The most common knowledge would be that they should be ranked at about 80 miles per hour at best. But what is important here is that despite Edward being slightly faster, like maybe 85 miles per hour at best, it isn't by much. It is merely marginal. Like, it's, yes, yes, James. Yeah, yes. While James was running away and Edward did catch up to Old Iron, it still doesn't explain that James and Edward are in a similar tiers of speed, not much faster, like below 90 miles per hour. So, Edward is just, so to put in short, Edward is just a little bit faster, but not a crazy amount like Gordon. But Edward is skilled. Well, absolutely, of course. But as I said before, in the Donald and Douglas video, when does skill matter if it falls under, like, raw power again? But Edward can endure pain. Yes, endurance is the only thing that is keeping him going. But even then, it's not much. Anything more? Edward can push with his might and has a greater attack potency. Honestly, that pushing strength feats is really overrated personally. Oh, so what if Edward can bank and push a heavy train uphill? So what? I haven't seen him try and pull even the heavier train like what he did in his exploits story again. Plus, what feats does he have compared to James like he had done in Philip to the Rescue? Not to mention, the term attack potency is very misunderstood, and how people think Edward can even get it over James is just dumb and a complete misuse. To put in short and simple definition, attack potency is all the energy focused in a single attack, so which is essentially similar to that of a striking strength. How does Edward get attack potency over James again? His stamina and agility would definitely help him, which shows a complete misunderstanding of attack potency as a whole. But then again, most Thomas editors are anti-power skillers anyway. Like, what the hell does speed, pushing strength, stamina, and agility have to do with an energy-based attack? The only attack potency feats for Edward I could think of was maybe in the James the Second Best episode of the Hit era, where James gets pushed by Edward and his new passenger train into the billboard. But don't start dancing yet. Like, that likely only works because of of Edward's coaches adding onto the weight and pushes. And remember, it's only one time throughout Edward's entire AP feats. But even then, James has a lot more AP in terms of feats and effectiveness than Edward would ever get, like smashing the tar tanker, plowing snow with Hector, destroying Titmuss shed wall, smashing into Gordon at the marshland, and others that I may miss. Fortunately, some people in Discord finally knows/admits this. Thank goodness, Dub City. But Edward can fight back really hard, right? Well, if you're fully knowledgeable about the characters and personality of every Thompson and his friend, no matter how much you can strike out Edward out of character, like what the Hit era did, and no matter how far you can make him as bloodlusted as possible, it goes against his character to be pretty violent and aggressive. You need to stick your controller up his non-existent butt to tell him how to fight like a Pokemon or something. But then again, even if you make Edward as bloodlusted and aggressive as possible, it still isn't a really close one. Yes, James is pretty much a dummy and hasn't shown much feats of, fighting back and holding his own, but I don't think that would be necessary due to a gap. So, what do you mean by power gap? Well, to answer that, we finally move on to how would the actual fight itself play out. Well, Edward only has overall smartness and endurance going for him, so he could put up some little struggle, but the issues for him, however, is that, like Donald and Douglas, Edward just doesn't have the exact attack potency, raw power, axis, and actual types of strength to damage or hurt James sufficiently, who, if I need to repeat myself, has all those categories all to himself. I'm not sure if his durability could even hold a chance against James's speed and weight, aside from the time he gets hit by a log on Misty Island. Even with his intelligence, Edward just simply can't do anything to James a lot. And if you remember what I said in that James vs. Donald and Douglas video, skills means very little if you can't hurt your opponent. Besides, James probably doesn't even need to use his brains here. He could probably just let Edward try to do his thing and then strike. You know what they say for fights between speed and strength. You can hit me 1,000 times, but I only need to hit you once. Edward can hit James a lot of times and chip some damage on, but one biff or bash from James is bound to be very devastating. Sure, Mr. Number 2 here may not be as poor, feetless, and neglected like Donald and Douglas were, but even then, still not saying much for Edward here. I believe the outcome is obvious. So in short, the moment Edward learned that James had beaten both Donald and Douglas at the same time before he fought him, it seems that the poor blue K2 should have just stopped while he was ahead. And now look where he is at now. A plummeled, beaten mess of old irons. James moves on, humbly admitting that he will never be as strong as Gordon and Henry, but knows that at least he's definitely in a new tier above him. Okay, I hate to say this, but the more I talk and discuss about Edward's best feats and achievement and comparing it to James, I can't help but feel that even Edward is overrated. Just like Donald and Douglas is, if not, worse. Even if Edward isn't overrated, he's definitely getting there. In fact, I'm gonna go all out here in this mini rant with no holdbacks. Edward is getting a lot of undeserved and unnecessary praise, like he's treated like Messiah since 2022. Like Old Iron, Exploit, and whatever feats are simply overrated just to give Edward a chance over James, when in reality it is not that close when IQ and endurance are barely useful. I know people have different opinions and they do provide very valid arguments for this matchup, which could definitely make me change some mind, but this is just ridiculous, even outside of this. Like, so, Mr. Train Friend 234, you say Edward is able to beat Boko despite the size and power differences, like 50,000 pounds. Yet people still have a hard time believing that Thomas can beat Duck, despite my previous video of, feats beating. I am frankly sick of following this stupid trend of Edward being superior over James, and I believe it is best that I speak up with an anger-filled but serious talk. If anything, Edward is more likely to get all that stupid fame into his smoke box, and in turn becomes a pretentious, egotistical bitch who makes even Gordon at his worst look like a misunderstood friend. Oh, but perseverance! Oh, but he's the first character! Oh, but unlucky said he's like Captain America! Oh, his feet! Oh, he's still. Nah, Edward can take those and shove it up into his firebox, burn it, and shut his trap up. But if I have to be nice at least, do I truly hate Edward? Well, no. But that isn't stopping me from holding a grudge if he gets wanked to to high heavens, while others like James are downplayed to all hells. Look, as annoying as someone like, at sad gaming 2867 can really get, I do get frustrated with him too. Like, that Henry versus Donald Douglas. I do deep down do feel bad for a lot of, flack he's getting, especially from, Great Western edits. Hey, remember that legendary slash monsterverse Godzilla vs. Final Wars Godzilla comparison I made before? And how I parodied James as monsterverse slash legendary Godzilla and Edward as Final Wars Godzilla? Well, not only do both of these matchup have some similarities, but also on how the topic has evolved. For the Godzilla side, back in 2014 and 2019, legendary Godzilla would have been argued to lose pretty badly to Final Wars Godzilla, before eventually 2021 to 2024 sees more feats and statements for Monsterverse slash legendary Godzilla to allow him to win over Final Wars at last. Though James still hasn't gotten his time to shine at the moment, this power scaling matchup of mine is to give James the respect he absolutely deserves, even if he is just as overrated to high heavens, like what Legendary and Monsterverse is getting. Meanwhile, Edward is equally overrated, which is, very secretly. But at this point, with what I talked about, even worse, like, he's almost on par with Final Wars Godzilla, where both of them gets a lot of, wank from not exactly useful feats or just blatant lies, like Final Wars getting the death of the author statement, and people making up bunch of BS like how Edward gets AP, attack potencies, a misunderstanding. Of course, no one is better than each other. Both Edward and James, and maybe even those two Godzillas, are very overrated. But right now, here, Edward is the guilty one here at the moment. Although I'm sure certain people like, I don't know, at this point I don't want to give out names anymore. But I'm sure some people are bound to be deaf to it. So to conclude, this is a truly shocking outcome, and is, if not, one of the most controversial take ever on this matchup, or in my entire channel. You thought Thomas vs. Doc or James vs. Donald and Douglas was bad? Well, think again. To my final verdict, James solos Edward. Barely even high diff at all. In fact, maybe even low diff if anything. Cry and scream about it all you want, harder this time, but at this point, I could care less. Power scaling or logic scaling, Edward has realistically and shall never ever beat James in a real fight. Like, anyone who dares to say James beats Edward are likely to get flamed and gets yelled at like it is some sort of crime, which is really stupid and retarded, which makes me feel bad for them, especially to those who have valid arguments. So, to speak up for them, melting Edward down here to mere liquid is a good justice for them. Because if I have to be as honest as I can, Edward, as once again, is secretly equally overrated as James, and the praises he gets is just way too exaggerated. Pretty ratty. Meanwhile, James is often gets the undeserved end of the stick all the damn time, and I'm once again, as I said again, sick of it. Like, for example, how come James isn't allowed to beat someone like Rebecca, but Edward could? For example, potentially wise. It comes off as unfair and hypocritical, which goes to show how ignorant most Thomas vs. editors and their audience can be, and the favoritism they like to play. I am sure that poor Fluffy Waffles was likely forced to change the view on this matchup because of a few certain bad words. And even if it wasn't, and he or they did it on their own accord, which I hope is the case, those mouths still likely had a role to play. Honestly, I really hope to see more Thomas versus Shorts revolving around this matchup, but where James actually wins over Edward, because if I have to repeat myself again and again, I am sick of seeing Edward getting that stupid, undeserved, ratty, spoiling praises in those versus edits community. Like, since when have I been more angry over one character? And the first, and it is the first, and the still legend, that is Edward, the one who is respected. But at this point, heck, maybe I'm maybe I'm even more angry with him than even Donald and Douglas. The fan base for Edward is just ridiculous, and it's probably best that I expose it the same way I did before to those great Western fathers. And don't worry, I'm already prepared for the flames, flags, and anything severe, uncordial, and uncivil coming my way. But I just don't care at this point. Power scaling topics, no matter what fandom, will always get their nasty sides and nasty fanboys, regardless of how nice, generous, and fair you are. In short, to finish off, I may not be able to change the community's outlook on Edward versus James, since I'm still small. Favoritism is still a bitch. People are bound to dunk on me and try to debunk my claims, and the impact gosh darn impact of Edward winning all the damn time has likely cemented so hard that it is hard to change it now. But hey, even if I am right that it will not work at all, at least I know that in my little channels, where my little rules and authority lays, and that I have the power to do whatever I want, James Solos.